Hey there. Today we're going to be looking at an overview of Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. We're about 3 weeks into the format, and things are starting to take shape. People are realizing what some of the better cards are and some of the better strategies and how they can play together. Uh, and that's being seen in just how the games are going and results for different archetypes and particular cards. So I thought a good starting point for the conversation is just the speed of the format, if you want to think about it that way, and how that affects like play and draw advantage. So if we're looking at just recent formats over the last year and a half, we can see the M's being Baldur's Gate. You can kind of recognize that this is a little bit faster than some of our other formats with best of three, at about 8.5 turns and a little under 9 turns for best of one premier draft compared to 9 to 10 turns for some of these other formats. Of note, when you're looking at these data, it's helpful to remember that if people, concede because they're in a board state where they don't think they can make it through, it's insurmountable. That will affect these data. So in particular, if there are some decks that are getting off the blocks a little quicker, or in a format like this where we don't have dual lands, so there is fixing in other ways. It's typically in green or through artifacts. But if you're not hitting a color and you're just on one color rather than the two or two plus a splash in your deck, you may be conceding a little earlier. So that can affect these numbers a little bit compared to some of the other formats. But still, it's shaping up to be a relatively quick format, all things considered, which doesn't mean that um, mid-range or controlling strategies can't work. And we'll kind of see that when we look at the decks and how they're performing. But we do have to recognize that, the original big boogeyman of the format for the first week or two, red white, that could just get off the blocks and win by turn 4 or 5, is present, and you have to be aware of that in deck building, though potentially not as much as prior. So to transition to how the decks are doing, of note, now that we have a large enough sample size to look at just the top performers in 17 lands, that's what I generally will filter by. Not that I don't want to look at how everybody's performing early on in the format, but those players that are doing better, having win rates, in the 60s, 62% with two color decks, for example, compared to if we look at all users, we're looking at win rates about 57.5%. It's nice to kind of glean what the top performers are seeing and doing. Of note, you can't necessarily just put the cards in the deck or play at the colors that the top performers are playing and expect to have those same results. Much of this is likely coming from play skill and evaluations, a lot of micro decisions, not necessarily just macro decisions. But all that being said, we can kind of see when we dig into like the two colors, for example, that what did at the biggest win rate early in the format, Boros, red white, is actually coming in, at about third, but it's within, margins of error and difference with like Selesnya green white and Orzhov white black. And part of that really, really makes sense because while people are saying this is like a Mardu format, black, white, red, it may actually be more that black, white, and green are really the colors that you could have as your base color. More than half your cards, many of your commons are coming from those colors and maybe being supplemented in a secondary color, of which red is pretty good, particularly with some of the aggro cards, as we see in Boros having a good win rate. Being more like uncommons, rares, mythics, not as frequently used compared to your base color. But a lot of that does point to Boros being your key aggro, as low to the ground as possible strategy, at least at the beginning of the format, compared to some of these more mid-range with like the Orzhov, or maybe even a little more controlling like the Selesnya, especially if you start splashing. You'll see like a Selesnya splash, Orzhov splash, have good win rates despite kind of so-so fixing, because green has good fixing, and then you get treasures from the black and the Orzhov pair, whereas these other decks aren't doing nearly as well with their splashes. Because you're just not having consistency, and the games aren't going to go so long that you can hope to draw out of it. You need to have some ways you've manufactured within your deck, through treasure, through, Understellar Myconids, Pilgrim's Eye, cards like that, or just, getting life gain to draw more cards, just card draw, if it's attached to a body like a, Priest of Ancient Lore, for example, to draw cards. But that does point to it not being a one deck format and not being an aggro format like was kind of being discussed early on. There's some mid-range and controlling strategies if you get the right defensive speed. And we'll look at some of these cards, like in black with the Shambling Gas, white with Priest of Ancient Lore, green with the Underseller Myconid, even like Lurking Roper at uncommon. You can stop Boros in its tracks and then let your bigger creatures kind of take over. That's just helpful to recognize that you don't have to just draft red white. You don't even have to draft Mardu. You can get into white or black or maybe green deep, and then supplement it with another color or two depending on what your fixing looks like. Additionally, I think it's helpful at this point to try and figure out, are there some commons, because these are going to be seen most frequently in the packs, that are maybe you can provide value. You can get them later in a draft, but may have some utility, either have been under-recognized and are just straight up gems useful, or maybe have enough functionality, optionality, that they can be useful. So if we start to look at white, for example, Steadfast Unicorn is a card that I think has now been recognized as something you have to consider both early and late in the game. It can come down and it can be activated once or twice potentially, and just make your board so big that you're going wide and tall, and it's tough to overcome that. But even cards like you hear something on Watch as a one-time shot on like a Steadfast Unicorn, or as a combat trick with the 2-drops, the double teams, just not being able to be drafted as consistently in one deck because there's more fighting over white-red. This isn't necessarily looks as bad as it maybe would have been if we were seeing a lot of double team 1-2 and then you only kill the attacker after they've double teamed. Now a lot of it is you can get rid of like a flyer or a bigger creature, or you can pump your whole team. And kind of related to that is Devoted Paladin. So a lot of this with white is going wide. So it makes sense that all three of these cards, relative to where they're being drafted, are winning. So I maybe should have oriented you, but this is win rate for top users, and then average last seen at on this axis. So you would imagine those that are seen later and have higher win rates will be above this line, and the opposite is below. Of note, this is just a straight line, but in reality, this should probably be a line here where it's drafted high, but it doesn't win. You're not going to play it, and then it comes at an angle, and then it probably just becomes a straight line where the win rate is so high, you're happy to draft, a Blessed Hippogriff or a Priest of Ancient Lore, a Patriarch's Humiliation, first, because it's winning so highly. So this dotted line is somewhat misleading, but it's good for just a general understanding. If we go to blue, we're going to see cards that are mostly focused on, catching up or defensive speed, that are doing well. So like Air Cult Elemental, for example, comes down 2/5 bodies, hard to get past, bounces a creature. There are a decent amount of enter the battlefield effects, so you can't bounce every creature your opponent has, for example, but oftentimes you can bounce through 3, 4, or 5 drop and establish some defense. Rime Shield Frostshine is tough to take out with Ward 3. So it comes down as a 4/5, and it'll block, the owlbears and, maybe some of the double team creatures, spawn, cards like that. It'll even block, Devoted Paladin, potentially. And it's tough to, use a Patriarch's Humiliation on, for example. Oftentimes opponents will have combat tricks or ways that are used to keep their creature alive that are used on their creatures, like a Dreadland Norm's Adventure, Blessed Hippogriff's Adventure, cards like that. So the Ward 3 isn't as great as it might otherwise be, but it can still be really useful for preventing, like a Sewer Plague or a Grim Bounty, cards like that. And then a pet card of mine, Hypnotic Pattern. You can get these last pick very often, and they can oftentimes neutralize one creature and then set up a favorable block on another creature. So you may be able to almost get a 2-for-1 with this at times. It doesn't draw a card, so it's not, just amazing potentially, but it can still be really good. You're looking at win rates that are similar to Air Cold Elemental, 62%, but last pickable oftentimes. And then of note, a card like Blue Dragon that is one of the better blue commons is oftentimes, it seems like, being drafted early. Maybe it's because people are saying this might be a signal that blue could be open. I'm going to take a flyer on it. Or they might be thinking, if I don't take this card and it gets passed, somebody else might see it as a signal that blue's open, like in pack 1, seeing it, pick 6, 7, 8. I don't know if that's the right way to think or not. I think it's going to be very draft dependent and even time in the format dependent. But just to recognize that it may not be pulling its weight with a win rate that's less than a couple other blue cards, despite being picked 4 or 5 spots higher on average. If we look at black, we see a smattering of what would generally be regarded as just average, medium plus cards that are doing well and are being drafted relatively late. And I think maybe a takeaway from this is if you're in black deep, you may be able to get some of these very late to the point where you don't have to, fight for playables. You're going to have some playables that, a card like a Summon Undead or a Chain Devil may be a lot better, like a black green, for example, than another type of deck. But you can still have some playables if you're not able to, drafts going tough. The table knows what's up and they're drafting really well, or the packs just aren't very strong that are being opened. But also notably, many of the top performing black cards are performing fairly closely to where you would expect them to be drafted. So you're not, overreaching with like a Deadly Dispute or a Sepulchre Ghoul, Vampire Spawn, or even like a Prowler or a Bounty, because that line we talked about where it probably goes more like this compared to just a straight line. And yeah, this is a set where removal is good again. So yeah, I mean, Bounty is going to be better than Sewer Plague, 8 to 9 times out of 10, but you need some of that in there, even if you have to pick it a little higher, because the opportunity cost is such that, if you just take another, your 4th Prowler over your 1st Bounty or something like that, just as an example, it's probably not worth it unless your deck is, just constructed in such a way that you're really just low to the ground. You're some 15 land, super aggro, mono black deck with, some higher rarity removal spells, for example. You're probably not going to want to do the Prowler over Bounty when you're looking at 4th Prowler versus 1st Bounty as an example. But yeah, there are some late possible gems in the right deck, so that's just good to know. Some of your late picks may be useful. And if we get into red, there's not too much. I'm not really going to buy into the Jaded Sellsword because it's just about 58%, but a card like Earth Cult Elemental that you can oftentimes get, in the last 1 to 2 picks, is one where you can say, okay, I can pick one of these up on almost any draft, and it might have utility, particularly in like a black-red where you can ramp it out a turn or 2 earlier, but even just as a bigger body that can play if you stabilize a little bit earlier. Maybe it's with like Valor Singer stabilizing earlier, or even if you aren't in the sack deck, you can use Incessant Provocation, to steal a creature so that it can't block anymore and helps you go a little wider, or helps you put a more profitable block on it when it has to attack the next turn. There's some ways to work well with that, and that's going just as late as Price of Loyalty was going in AFR. So there's some gems there, though they are a little more deck dependent. And then if we're looking at green, probably the 2 biggest takeaways. One is Ettercap, just all-star card apparently. But I mean, there's I want to say format warping, but there's cards that do shape the format to some extent, and that's like Blessed Hippogriff, for example, and some of the mythic dragons. Ettercap really does work, and it can come down to provide some defensive speed as a 5-drop, for example. So yeah, your opponent might get, 2-for-1 you with their Blessed Hippogriff by using the Adventure and then playing it, on turn 4. But I mean, if you can, kill it on your turn 4, turn 5 with an enter cap, and then still have this to be able to play as a creature, you're catching up some. And they're really a good card as being somewhat nullified by your card that you probably got on the wheel, which can be nice. And then there's some optionality with like the line up the shot that some of the top players are maybe able to take advantage of, or even just like the life gain with Inspiring Bard to put a body down that can trade, gain 3 life, that maybe takes away the damage was dealt to him, like a a turn 3 attack from an opponent. And then the second real takeaway is 6/7 drops in green aren't bad, and there may be even like a value pick with Herd Gorger, and then still probably a good pick with Dreadlenorm, just given how high the win rate is. So I mean, if you have the right defensive speed, and that's like the Underseller Myconids to just stay alive, then yeah, I mean you can get to these beefy creatures that can help stabilize with Herd Gorger in the game with Dreadlenorm. And then on colorless, just helpful to recognize that some of the stronger players are getting a little more out of Pilgrim's Eye because they're comfortable looking at the 2-color mid-range controlling decks, or the 2 splash, a color or 2, and they're seeing it as something that can trade with, like a 3/1 your opponent played on turn 2, net you a card, a land, but I mean you need lands to cast your 5, 6, 7 drops, and net you a card 2 for 1 there potentially. And then format All-Star Iron Golem is now being recognized as maybe not format All-Star, maybe red-white, but probably the other decks is not really showing up as where you want to be in the format. So then all that to get to a little bit of summary data. While people are saying it was a Mardu format, if you look at the top commons and the top performers, a lot of it's white, black, and some green actually. Granted that the greens don't necessarily come up as often, but you're seeing Dreadlenorm, Underseller Myconid, Inspiring Bard, and Herd Gorger, all in the top 15 or so, which is a good representation for a color, and that's across the curve, from 3 and 4 drops to 6 and 7 drops. Also, white, with some of the 3 of the top 4 cards, like game and hand win rate, and there's a lot of stuff that's around the 64%. You see your Steadfast Unicorn, Understar Myconid, Shambling Gas, and Patriarch's Humiliation, and even Dreadlenorn, all in the 64 to 64.5 range. So when you could think of those as just in a tier that is probably below Blessed Hippogriff and Preservation Lore, but is in a tier right there. And then a lot of these are 1 to 3 drops or removal, like the Grim Bounties. They hear something on watches. Or they're a little higher up the curve after you're able to stabilize, like the Herd Gorgers, the Dreadlenorms, for example. So it's just something to think about and consider. In addition to where you can pick the cards is I mean, you still have those first 3 to 5 picks in a draft, and you want to get just good cards out of that, even if you're not necessarily getting like value. And then just to put this in perspective, I wanted to look at some of the decks from the last week I've had that have trophied. And of note, I've got 17 trophies across 2 accounts, and I'm doing well in the format. So just so people feel like they can maybe put some credence in what I'm saying. 68, win rate, 10 runs out of 20 something drafts on the main account, and then on the other one that was formed when all of our main accounts were made unusable when we hit Mythic a few months ago. The second one, and kind of similar, 7 trophies. I think it's 17 out of 40 drafts, which is like a 43% trophy rate, and about half of those, maybe a little less than half, are in Mythic, and the rest are in Diamond and a smattering and Platinum as you're going up just the path to get to Mythic. So all that to say, these are against good competition, and that the play could probably be a little better if I were a little tighter, a little better. We'd probably have 20 trophies or something like that. But I think that the play is such that you could look at these and say, with some reps, or you might already be better than me. I could trophy with these types of decks in the last week. So in particular, we've got a black-white, splash red, and I try not to splash too much in this format unless I've got green or a lot of treasure. Um, but this was kind of an exception where I felt like the deck was, you know, aggro, but not like, just balls to the wall, pedal to the metal aggro, more on the aggro mid range side, and then just, a game ender and ambergris on the white side was worth splashing. And with, Grim Bounty, a couple shambling gas, um, it felt doable. And it happened a few times. But I mean, we're looking at, good curve, good interaction with the 3 blessed hippogriffs. Didn't have humiliation, so needed some other good interactions. So I had like the Armor of Shadows to do an Adventure of Hippogriff, impersonation, and then just enough removal, with like the gas, the plague, the bounty. But it was a deck that did require a lot of tight play to kind of make work. This one was black-red, where we splash white. And I mean, Blessed Hippogriff is probably the best common in the set. And I mean, it's worth splashing in some decks, in particular, a deck like this where I'm happy to lift up, a Valor Singer or a Ghoul, for example, or creature that I've stolen if I really need to, and then use the front half off of a treasure, either with like a Grim Bounty, a Kalane, Ghast Robber. This was pointing at having to be kind of scrappy. This is when the draft started getting a little bit tougher, and we had to play, some cards like Unexpected Allies and, some Horde Robbers, things like that you might not necessarily, just be super stoked and excited to play. But, I mean, you find a way to find some synergy, say, well, we've got a lot of duplicates of cards. We've got some good early drops we don't mind, giving double team to. If you can give double team, to a Rabbler, Rouser, so you get 2 of them in your hand when you attack, that's fantastic. Or a Prowler, a Ghoul. So it was a deck that required, some scrappiness, but it had a plan, and it wasn't afraid to splash with enough treasure, knowing it wasn't an aggro deck. It was more of a mid-range deck, and it oftentimes played the controlling side of mid-range against like the red-whites that were still showing up and were still fairly consistent at this point, with a lot of 1/3s on 2 that could attack when they needed to, so they could play offense or defense. 2/3s that they could kind of do the same. And this was my first foray into blue, and pet card of mine is now OG. And this was just a depressing deck for many opponents to play against, because you're just playing these defensive speed cards like your 2/3s that can ramp you, your Priest of Ancient Lore that will trade with their 2-drop and draw you a card, your Lizardfolk Librarians that just puts up a wall 2/4, lets you scry a better card. So it's almost playing that Imperial Oath that we had from Kamigawa. And then if you're blue, you're probably going to need a bomb or two. So like the Snowborn Simulacra is what oftentimes made the game go from, oh, I'm playing defensively, I'm stabilizing, I'm at 10 to 14 life, we're getting to turn 6, 7, 8. Use a Conjure to ramp this up to give you an X of 5 or 6, and just do it to it. But we also had some air attack to get over to finish the game, and blue's good at that. If you can stabilize, with your 2, 3, 4 drops, and oftentimes they're in other colors because blue doesn't have great 2 drops or 3 drops, then yeah, you can get to the later game. And then you knew there'd have to be at least one red-white in there. And this is one that was predominantly white with just a bit of red. And really it was for Liara, which is a pretty good card. It's not busted. It's probably not something you should be first picking anymore, if you ever should have. But it was useful, especially with 2 Rasads, 4 Hippogriffs. It made it so you could have a little bit of, push through, follow through, because there were only a few double team creatures in this one. So this played more like aggro mid range. And then our next to last one is again looking at OG in a shell that's predominantly white and with green for enough defensive speed with like Circle of the Land Druid and the Myconids to slow people down. Lurking Roper has just been an absolute house in the last week for me. And then enough removal and enough, inevitability with like the Ascend and the OGs to kind of end the game. And then finally, another blue deck. And this one actually started out green-white, and you can see, like, we've got some first pickable cards, like Steadfast Unicorns, Priest of Ancient Lores, for example. But it wasn't aggressive enough, so it started 0-2. Even Trilasara, Pegasus. And I said, I'm going to try blue in this one. And blue had a lot of late game, with the Air Colts, Sword Coast Serpent, and it had a way to get there with like the undersimplifies, the roadblocks, like the 3 Lurking Ropers. Zone I Spy might have drawn me 2 cards in 7 games, but it did a really good job of blocking or stopping attacks. And I mean, Thayan Evokers, was not able to be played in the first version. It's a straight up bomb. Probably best card in blue, maybe with some Lacra. So again, the format in a sense is slowing down because the red-white are not as streamlined as before, but you still have to have some early drops to make some trades if you're a slower deck or put up the defensive speed with like the Lurking Ropers, cards like that. So all that to say, I think the format is really exciting. The gameplay is strong. The drafts are getting more interesting as things are more contested. It's a format I'm enjoying. So yeah, I hope this is useful for you. And yeah, happy to chat about it if you want to.